Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video, we're going to be discussing best practices for strengthening the calf muscles, also known as the triceps surae. Now, the term triceps surae has two parts, triceps and surae. The surae part refers to the posterior side, backside, of the lower leg. The front side, where you've got the anterior compartment, tibialis anterior, etc., that's the crural region or the crus region, as it's called. The backside is the sural region, so that's the origin of the surae. We're talking about the backside of the lower leg. Now, the term triceps, we think of the triceps as being up here, and the triceps brachii, that is truly a three-headed muscle. You've got a medial head, a long head, and a lateral head. But in the calf region, do we truly have a three-headed muscle? Not necessarily. We actually have, comprising the triceps surae, the gastrocnemius and the soleus. Now that's two muscles, so why is it triceps? Well, all three of these muscles, as you can see right here in the image, they insert inferiorly, or I should say distally, down on the calcaneus via the Achilles tendon. And the superficial of these muscles is the gastrocnemius. It's also the larger of the two, and it is a two-joint muscle. It crosses both the ankle and the knee joint, which will be an important thing to consider later on. Now, the gastrocnemius is in and of itself a two-headed muscle. There's a medial part, the medial gastrocnemius, and a lateral part, the lateral gastrocnemius. And just jumping ahead a little bit, when you're training calves and trying to get the calf muscles stronger and bigger, there's really not any circumstance I can think of where you need to bias the medial head or bias the lateral head. If you're training calves in general appropriately, both sides of the gastroc, medial and lateral, are going to get stronger and they're going to get bigger and they're going to improve in whatever parameter it is you're working on. So no need to really consider either head, but those are two heads comprising the triceps surae. The third is the soleus, and the soleus you can see in red there, deep to the gastrocnemius. It does not cross the knee joint. It only crosses the ankle joint, and so it's only a one-joint muscle. And so soleus comprises the third head, thus triceps surae. Now, before we get too deep into specific exercises to strengthen the calf muscles, I think it's very important to understand how do we get more out of the gastrocnemius, how do we get more out of the soleus. It turns out that you can bias one or the other, and it largely has to do with the knee joint angle. So to understand this a little better, let's take a look at this graph right here. On the vertical or y-axis, we have total force output by all the calf muscles, and we're really just considering gastrocnemius G and soleus S. And then we're going to look at 5 different scenarios. Now, the first scenario we're going to look at here is where the calf complex is going to press, I guess let's say, or push 200 pounds worth of force, and the knee is fully extended. In other words, the knee is at 0 degrees. This is where the one versus two joint muscle argument comes into play. So the soleus is a one joint muscle. It only crosses the ankle joint and therefore only participates in ankle plantar flexion. Therefore, directly speaking, it is unaffected by the knee joint angle, directly speaking. The gastrocnemius, on the other hand, is a two joint muscle. Crosses the ankle joint, performs ankle plantar flexion, but it also crosses the knee joint and gives not a majority percentage, but a fairly decent percent contribution to knee flexion. Now, of course, the hamstrings are the major knee flexor, but the gastrocnemius also participates in that. For example, anyone that's done a Nordic hamstring curl knows that this is an excellent exercise for also strengthening the gastrocnemius. We'll be covering that more in the hamstring videos, but understand that it's a pretty good exercise for the gastrocnemius. That being said, when the knee is bent or the knee is flexed, the gastrocnemius is shortened. And when a muscle is shortened, particularly a two-joint muscle, it goes on active insufficiency and is not able to exert as much force output. When the knee is fully extended, the gastrocnemius is not shortened. So the gastrocnemius is going to best function when the knee is fully extended. Now, in this case of 200 pounds worth of force, the gastrocnemius is going to take the brunt of that load. It's going to be the greater percent contributor relative to the soleus, but the soleus does contribute. It's not that the soleus isn't active. The soleus is always active here, but the gastrocnemius just takes the vast majority of that load, okay? So it's all about the relative percent contributions there. Now, case number 2, 150 pounds worth of force. So knee is still fully extended, so we're going to expect the relative force outputs by Gastrocnemius Soleus to be the same, but they're going to be scaled down proportionally because now we're only having to lift 150 pounds worth of force. Knee joint angle, still the same. So the relative contributions are the same, but the absolute contributions of each muscle drop accordingly. And we can play that same game here with the third case, 100 pounds worth of force. Still, the knee joint is fully extended, and the percent contributions of each muscle stay the same. It's just their absolute output decreases proportionally. So now here's where it gets interesting. Now we're going to consider a case where we're still having to exert 100 pounds worth of force, 100 pounds. Force hasn't changed, to make this simple, but we're going to bend the knee to about 45 degrees. So we're bending the knee now. Remember, it has no direct effect on the soleus. However, the gastrocnemius is getting more into a shortened position. So the gastrocnemius is now on some degree of active insufficiency. And in order to keep that force output of 100 pounds, now the soleus is going to have to take a greater percent contribution than it did when the knee was fully extended, as you see right here, because the gastroc is not able to exert as much force in an actively insufficient position. And if we carry this on to case number 5 here, where now we're bending the knee to 90 degrees, but still keeping the same force output at 100 pounds, now the gastrocnemius is on even more active insufficiency. So it's even less efficient in this position. So the soleus now has to exert a greater percent contribution than even compared to 45 degrees of knee bending. So based on this information, and this will be important towards the end of the video, there's really 2 ways that you can really hit the soleus hard. One way is to just perform a seated heel raise, where your knee is bent to, let's say, 90 degrees. That puts the gastrocnemius on active insufficiency, and then as you progressively overload it with more and more resistance, the soleus is going to have to work harder. The other way you can do this is just by doing a standing heel raise with the knees fully extended, and then just load it with a lot of weight. Yes, the gastrocnemius is going to get stronger, but also the soleus, as you go to 300 pounds, 400 pounds, and etc., the soleus is going to have to work even harder. It's just going to be a lower percent contribution than the gastrocnemius. And at some point, these standing heel raises have so much weight that they actually are going to trump the seated heel raise for targeting soleus. But that's an argument for another video. One more consideration, and then we'll get to the specific exercises, and that is the dosing on calf strengthening. Somewhere along the line, there became this idea that calf muscles respond well to 20 repetitions, like high repetitions. I'm not really sure where that came from. In general, calf muscle isn't really that different than any other muscle group. So if you want to get it stronger and you want to get it bigger, your best bet is to treat it like any other muscle. Load a lot of weight on it and decrease the number of repetitions. There's nothing wrong with doing 3 to 4 repetitions at a really, really high weight for strength. There's also nothing wrong with sticking in the 7 to 10 rep range with slightly lower weight, but still pretty significant weight for hypertrophy. And I can tell you, having come from 2 ankle surgeries, one on each ankle to remove a bone, and having resulting calf weakness on both sides, that method has worked significantly better than just going after high repetitions, okay? So when you are dosing the calf muscles for strengthening, it's not any different than any other muscle group, okay? So that being said, let's get into specific strengthening exercises for plantar flexion, for the calf muscles. Now, this one I'm not going to linger on too long because it's not really that useful for very long. This is banded plantar flexion, as you see right here. Again, if we do it with the knee straight, fully extended, we're going to have a greater percent contribution of the gastrocnemius. And then as we get the knee bent to, let's say, 45, 90 degrees or whatnot, now the soleus starts to become the greater percent contributor to this. But with the band resistance, again, it's only going to go so far, and it's not really functional. Not that everything has to be functional, but when you walk, you're using your calves in a closed kinetic chain position. When you jump, when you do pretty much anything, your calves are in a closed kinetic chain position, or at least your feet are. So we want to go to exercises where we are weight bearing. Now, if a person is unable to weight bear, the banded plantar flexion is a great exercise, but typically I try to move away from this as quickly as possible because also these other exercises are going to be far more effective. Now, the first of these exercises, and no, I am not necessarily a proponent of the ATG systems and protocols, but these FHL heel raises. I think for lower level individuals or people recovering from different types of injuries or surgeries, the FHL heel raise is actually extremely useful and it's underrated. Overrated for higher level athletes and higher level individuals in general. But for people that are in recovery and physical therapy, this is actually a very useful exercise. There's a few reasons it's useful. Number one is for people that have tight calves. You get a stretch of the gastrocnemius at the bottom. And what you can even do is, you can see my forearms are up on the wall. At the bottom, I could even push through the wall and accentuate the stretch at the bottom. And then as you do the heel raise, you're starting in a position of dorsiflexion and you're going into plantar flexion. So theoretically, you can get full range of motion on this exercise. And because you have your forearms on the wall like this, you have that added stability. And so it's good for people with poor balance, good for people with just weak calves in general, because when you throw in that added stability, that signals to the brain, hey, this is a safe position. So the brain feels better about having the muscles exert a greater force output, and so it's going to be a pretty effective exercise for those individuals. I can also tell you from experience that FHL heel raises tend to be more tolerated for people that have conditions like a Morton's neuroma, so things of the foot that are just not fun to weight bear on. Metatarsalgia, Morton's neuroma. When I was recovering from the neuroma, this was my go-to exercise, and now I don't have to rely on it, but it's really good for cases like that. And you can progress it from double leg to a staggered position, and then eventually to single leg. But beyond that, the only con of this exercise is that it's difficult to progressively overload beyond that. And so once you get to a point where you're pretty easily able to do the single leg FHL heel raises, my recommendation is to move to a standing heel raise. And you can certainly do a standing heel raise from the floor, but if you can get a deficit where you're standing on a ledge or a plate or something where your heel can go down over the edge, that is ideal, and there are studies to prove that. So they have done studies where, so here's the platform, here's the foot, right? Right here would be my heel, okay? They've done studies where they look at people that go just the top half of the range, and then people that go full range, and believe it or not, the outcomes are not that dissimilar. But a third group, where they loaded enough weight to where they could go down to the bottom and then really just get up to neutral, maybe a hair past, but just that, almost that bottom half of the range, those had the best outcomes. So two things come from this. Number one, you absolutely want a deficit for that heel to go over. You can certainly do these from the floor, but it's not going to be as effective. You need a deficit, okay? Number two, I would load enough weight on there to where you literally can't go up to the top, where you have enough weight to where you can get to neutral, but not much past that. Studies show that's going to give you the best outcome for strength and hypertrophy of the calves, okay? So standing heel raises there. That then leads us to exercise number 3, which is the donkey heel raise. Now, the donkey heel raise I'll be showing in just a minute, but it suffices to say that most people think you need a machine to do this. You don't need a machine. You can actually do it with a very similar setup to what I had for the standing heel raise just a minute ago. The knee is still fully extended. We're still going to have a deficit for that heel to go over. The big difference here is that instead of standing upright, you're going to do it in a hip hinge position. So take a look at this right here. So very similar setup to the standing heel raise, but once I have my feet in position, I'm going to hinge forward as if I'm about to do a stiff-legged deadlift. What I want to feel here is a very strong stretch in the hamstrings and potentially the calf as well. What we're trying to do is put a stretch on the hamstrings. You say, why are we doing that? We're training calves. Well, it turns out that within the knee, really the back side of the knee, kind of the popliteal region, the calf tendons proximally course around the distal hamstring tendons, kind of like this, okay? Kind of like that. And so if I stretch the hamstrings enough, it will actually tug on the proximal gastroc tendons and give them a little bit of an extra stretch too. So theoretically, the donkey heel raise gives an even greater stretch to the gastrocnemius, and that is theoretically superior to the standing heel raise. Now, I can't say if there's actually a big difference in outcomes between the two, but a lot of people swear by the donkey heel raise. You hinge forward to the point that you get a really strong hamstring stretch, and then you let your heels descend over the edge into that deficit, and that will give you a very powerful calf stretch. And then you do heel raises as before, okay? Again, playing into that stretch-mediated hypertrophy idea. So, every exercise we've seen up to this point kind of follows those first 3 bars, so to speak, in that graph, where the knee's fully extended. So we're getting soleus, but we're getting more gastrocnemius. And the more stretch we put on those muscles, the better the outcome. But we also want to be able to more specifically target the soleus. And so, as I mentioned earlier in the video, one way to do that is by putting the gastrocnemius on active insufficiency with the knee bent. And that leads to the seated heel raise, which you can see right here. So again, seated heel raise, not any different in the sense that you also want a deficit so we can get a stretch in those muscles. But the knee is bent to 90 degrees here. So the gastrocnemius is on a fair amount of active insufficiency, so its amount of force output through plantar flexion drops. And so the soleus now has to pick up a greater percent contribution to that movement. And so as you progressively overload the seated heel raise, you get more and more soleus strengthening and potentially hypertrophy, okay? That being said, another way you can get more soleus is just by doing any of the standing heel raises, whether it's the regular standing or the donkey heel raise, and just load a huge amount of weight on it. Again, it's still going to hit soleus. It's just the gastrocnemius has a greater percent contribution, but it still gets soleus. But you can also do a seated heel raise. Now, at some point, when you're doing standing heel raises, the amount of load that you're doing is so significant that it kind of renders the seated heel raise not as effective. So if you're only doing like 50 pounds in a standing heel raise, a seated heel raise might be better. But as you start to load up 200, 300, 400, 500 pounds on a standing heel raise, the amount of soleus contribution is going to be greater than what you could expect on a seated heel raise. And so the standing versions become superior. But you kind of have to see what works for you specifically, okay? So hopefully this video gave you a really good understanding about how we go about strengthening the various calf muscles and what are the best exercises to do so. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.